The year is 700 AD, and the Korean peninsula is locked in a battle against a monster no army could defeat. Can you believe that entire civilizations survived an enemy far more relentless, far more efficient at killing than any invading horde? It wasn't swords or siege engines they feared. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of a Siberian winter. This wasn't just cold. This was an atmospheric weapon designed by nature itself, a cataclysmic, soul-crushing deep freeze, where the very air crystallized into microscopic shards of lethal ice. In the mountains, when the wind screamed down from the north, temperatures didn't just drop, they plunged into an absolute abyss where human survival was statistically impossible. Yet, amidst this elemental carnage, a miracle existed. A secret woven into the very foundation of their homes, a defiant act of architectural rebellion against the ice god. They called it the Ondol. But this miracle came with a price, a terrible, horrifying cost that stalked the halls of every sleeping family, waiting for the smallest lapse in judgment, the faintest drift in the wind. A catastrophe no one saw coming, until it was already too late, until the warmth that saved them became the poison that stole their souls, and the fire that consumed their sanctuary. Imagine this scene. Outside, the world is rigid. The streams are mute, locked beneath 6 feet of unforgiving ice. The brutal moon reflects off the unforgiving snow, casting shadows that look exactly like lurking, starved predators. The homes of the Silla Kingdom stand like isolated islands in an ocean of lethal, 0-degree air.
Inside, a specific family sleeps. They are bundled, yes, but they are not shivering. They are resting directly on the floor. Not a cold, damp earthen floor that guarantees sickness and death, but a surface radiating a gentle, life-giving heat that permeates the very marrow of their bones, protecting them from the lethal chill rising from the ground.
This is not simple magic. This is raw fire harnessed, tamed, and forced to crawl beneath heavy stone. This is the oldest, most dramatic form of radiant heat known to man, a technological marvel built from packed earth, massive stone slabs, and the desperate, ingenious necessity of ancient engineers fighting for their very existence. The patriarch, Farmer Hyun, wakes suddenly, a clammy sweat stinging his eyes. He doesn't wake from a nightmare about ghosts. He wakes from the sheer, overwhelming, paralyzing awareness of the cold pressing against the wooden walls, whispering its promises of swift death just inches away from his head. He knows the terrifying truth better than anyone in the village. The warmth is not guaranteed. It is earned moment by agonizing moment, stoked by relentless, exhausting labor, and fueled by the finite, dwindling resources of the exhausted forest. The logistics of survival were a constant, daily knife fight.
He swings his feet onto the floor. It is blissfully warm, almost scalding. The intense heat generated hours ago in the Agungi, the furnace mouth located strategically outside the house, has traveled through a labyrinth of winding stone flues, warming the massive foundation stones, gudo, directly beneath their sleeping mats. This thermal mass is the only thing keeping the grave cold at bay.
But this perfect warmth is a lie, a dangerous, intoxicating deception that lulled entire families into a false sense of security. Hyun knows exactly what happens when the fire is inefficient, when the smoke lingers too long within the system, or, God forbid, when the deadly winter wind shifts suddenly and forces the toxic, invisible exhaust back into the living space where they sleep. He knows the harrowing tales whispered around the dwindling communal fires, the stories of neighbors who went to sleep perfectly warm and never woke up again, killed not by the outside frostbite, but by the very breath of the fire they relied upon for their lives. The silent killer was always the most devastating. The Ondol system is a beautiful monster. It demands sacrifice. It requires constant, grinding vigilance. And on this particular night, the night the great Siberian cold finally broke the thermometer and threatened to crack the bedrock itself, Hyun felt a deep, chilling dread settle over him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside the walls. He looks towards the furnace door, visible through the small iced-over window, and sees the telltale shimmer of intense, uncontrolled combustion. The fire is burning too hot, too fast. He realizes, with a gut-wrenching lurch of panic, that the precious, dry oak fuel he packed into the agungi before midnight is consuming itself exponentially, threatening to overheat the delicate stone slabs to a catastrophic, house-burning degree. If the stones get too hot too quickly, they fracture and crack, releasing smoke and sparks directly into the room. If the soot builds up, the entire system chokes and the chimney draft fails instantly. If the chimney draft fails, the invisible gas of pure, odorless death floods the sleeping chamber, guaranteeing eternal slumber for everyone inside. Hyun stands there, frozen not by the cold invading the room, but by the paralyzing choice presented to him. Risk letting the heat die entirely and freezing his family slowly before dawn, or feed the raging beast and risk a horrifying, fiery, or poisoned end. This floor, this perfect salvation, was also their cunning, inescapable executioner. This is the untold, high-stakes story of the Ondol, the greatest architectural survival mechanism in history, and the terrifying, relentless price paid for every single degree of warmth harvested from the earth. This is the deep story of the ancient Korean people, locked in a deadly, eternal dance with the deadliest winter on earth, relying on a system that could turn against them at any moment. And tonight, the dance floor was getting dangerously, lethally hot. The sound was not a crackle, but a deafening silence. Outside, the Siberian breath, the true warlord winter, had dropped the temperature to a degree that didn't just freeze water, it tried to freeze the very soul out of the body. Inside the small Silla-era home, the family was huddled, waiting for the miracle, or the judgment, to arrive beneath their very feet.
The initial fire, stoked deep within the agungi, the beating heart of this deadly machine, was already roaring. Old man Kim, his face etched with worry lines deeper than the stones he was standing on, watched the smoke climb, praying it followed the path designed for life, not the path leading to silent death. The crucial moment was the transition, the tipping point where latent cold met explosive heat.
They weren't waiting for air to warm. They were waiting for rock to surrender its icy grip. The entire floor was constructed of massive, thick slabs of granite or schist, the guruljang, suspended over intricate subterranean tunnels, the korai. These stones were the thermal battery, slow to charge, but catastrophic if overcharged. The physics of this survival mechanism was a razor's edge calculation. If the stones heated too slowly, the family would succumb to hypothermia before dawn, their blood slowing into sludge. If they heated too quickly, the fierce expansion could crack the ancient, fragile clay mortar sealing the system, allowing the lethal vapor to seep up through the sleeping mats and into their lungs. Every minute was a calculation of combustion. Kim watched the smoke struggling through the labyrinthine gorai, forced by pressure beneath the heavy guduljang. It was a race against the clock, a battle between the density of the stone and the unrelenting ferocity of the flame he had just birthed. To achieve the necessary all-night burn, the 8 hours of sustained heat required to survive until sunrise, Kim had packed the agungi not just with dry kindling, but with dense, partially wet logs, the dreaded amok. This wasn't for efficiency. It was for longevity, guaranteeing a slow, smoldering burn. But these logs burned slow, smoky, and unbelievably rich in the invisible, odorless assassin, carbon monoxide. This deadly ghost had no smell, no color, no mercy. It was the silent tax collected by the winter warlord, an unavoidable hazard of surviving the Ice Age. Every family knew the lore, passed down in terrified whispers. If you woke up with a headache, a sudden dizziness, or worse, didn't wake up at all, the heat had won the battle, but the poison had taken the war. Their salvation was their executioner, ready to strike without sound. The very air they breathed, even before the poison struck, was thick with the anxiety of existence. The children, sleeping near the warmest spot, the amok, closest to the firebox entrance, were simultaneously the most privileged and the most fatally endangered sleepers in the house, nestled directly above the most intense point of combustion. Suddenly, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, a warmth, not yet comforting, but almost aggressive, started to climb up through the thick rush sleeping mats. The guduljang had finally accepted the fire's offering. It was a primal, earthy heat, unlike anything else, a heat birthed from rock and smoke, radiating from the very core of the earth.
Kim pressed his palm flat against the floor near the corner. It was searing hot. Too hot. He couldn't tell. The margin for error was infinitesimally small. If the fire blazed too fiercely now, the heat could actually scorch the underside of the delicate rice paper walls. Or worse, ignite the dried grass insulation packed into the roof eaves, turning the home into a pyre.
The fear of fire was immediate. The fear of the ghost gas was delayed, insidious, waiting patiently for them to drift into the deepest stage of sleep. He had to damp the fire just enough to maintain the immense thermal mass for the entire night, but not so much that the pressure differential failed entirely.
If the pressure failed, the deadly smoke would cease its journey through the gore, and, following the path of least resistance, back up through any crack, any fissure, any microscopic weakness in the floor structure, flooding the sleeping area.
He needed the perfect, almost impossible equilibrium. Too much draft, and the heat escapes too quickly. Too little, and the house fills with the sweet, deadly smell of burning earth. Outside, the wind screamed, a predatory howl attempting to rip the thatched roof off the structure, simultaneously creating a terrifying downdraft in the exit flue. The yundole, the crucial vertical chimney stack at the far end of the house, was supposed to be pulling the spent smoke out cleanly, creating the necessary suction. If the gale overwhelmed it, the entire system would backfire, literally, blowing the deadly exhaust back into the tunnels and seeking escape upward.
He moved quietly to the back wall, listening intently, his ear almost pressed to the hardened mud. Was that a slight hiss? The sound of gas escaping? Or just the contraction of the cooling wood beams? Every groan of the house was magnified into a warning siren, a death knell in the frigid night.
The fate of his entire lineage rested on the flawless function of ancient engineering and his ability to read the temper of the fire with the instinct of a seasoned survivor. The night was a long, cold predator, and the ondel was the only shield against the Siberian slaughter.
But right now, standing over the humming stones, Kim felt less like a defender and more like a sacrificial priest, waiting to see if his offering would save them or consume them entirely. The deadly warmth continued to radiate, promising survival, but whispering lethal threats with every silent degree gained.
The night deepens, becoming a vast, crushing silence, broken only by the shriek of the Selhan wind tearing at the thatched eaves. Outside the paper-thin walls of the hanok, the temperature plunged far below freezing, where breath instantly crystallized into deadly shards of ice. This was the moment the winter antagonist truly began its siege, testing the very limits of human endurance. Park, the father, lay rigid on the heated floor, his muscles locked in a desperate vigilance even in sleep. He should have been comforted by the deep, pervasive heat soaking into his bones, but instead, a cold dread clawed at his throat. The heat was magnificent, almost luxurious, yet it was the very silence of the system that screamed betrayal. He inhaled slowly, testing the air for that faint, cloying sweetness, the unmistakable signature of the odorless killer. the phantom that walked on silent feet and choked its victims without ever raising a sound. Every sleeping breath taken by his wife and children was a measurement of risk, a terrifying wager placed upon the integrity of ancient stone and packed clay. Beneath his sleeping mat lay the fragile battlefield, the Gudel, a labyrinth of thick, interlocking stone slabs, carefully suspended over the flue paths, known as the Gore.
These stones were the critical barrier, the only thing separating life-giving warmth from suffocating smoke. They had to be precisely spaced, each slab tilted slightly to ensure the efficient movement of hot gases, and sealed with layers of meticulous clay mortar, resisting the immense thermal stress of fire below and the brutal cold above. This was not mere construction. It was a deadly, practical art, passed down through generations of careful masons.
Every single firing of the furnace, every dramatic shift in temperature, from blazing inferno to frigid night air, placed unimaginable stress on this ancient infrastructure. Over time, the constant expansion and contraction inevitably created tiny, microscopic fissures in the clay seal, invisible to the eye, but potent enough to kill an entire family. These were the invisible wounds of the system, the perfect, silent conduits for carbon monoxide to seep upward and fill the sleeping chamber, drowning the inhabitants in sleep itself. Park knew the deadly mathematics better than anyone. One hairline crack, one failed seam in the centuries-old technique, and the gentle warmth would transform into a lethal gas chamber. His children lay curled beside him, utterly dependent on his engineering prowess and his desperate ability to read the temperamental floor. He was the only watchman against a killer that operated without sound, without smell, and without mercy. Suddenly, a sound pierced the heavy quiet. Not the shriek of the wind, but a low, subterranean groan from beneath the thick floor. It was the sound of the structure shifting, perhaps a settling stone, or worse, a warning of a pressure imbalance in the deep, winding flue channel. He slid his hand out from beneath the heavy ibbles, quilts, placing his palm flat against the warmest section of the floor, the area directly above the hottest part of the Gore. Too hot, significantly too hot. The warmth was not supposed to feel scalding. It should have been a gentle, uniform embrace across the entire surface. Scalding heat meant the draft was compromised, failing to pull the spent smoke and lethal exhaust gases quickly and efficiently to the faraway chimney exit. If the smoke lingered, it pressurized the system, forcing the toxins through the smallest imperfections in the mortar and stone. He realized with paralyzing clarity he had to check the yondo, the chimney path. Moving with the ghost-like silence of a man who understood the fragility of deep sleep, Park slipped from under the heavy bedding. The sudden transition from the blazing heat of the floor to the ambient air of the room felt like plunging into a frozen lake. He quickly wrapped himself in a thick woven cloak. Every fiber of his body screamed to stay beside the life-saving floor, yet duty, the grim necessity of survival, pulled him toward the door latch. He pulled the wooden door slightly ajar, The winter antagonist immediately surged in, a monstrous wave of sub-zero air that stole his breath and froze the moisture in his eyes, instantly whitening his eyelashes. The world outside the Hanok was a crystalline deathscape, illuminated weakly by the merciless moon and the glittering frost. He had to circle the structure, navigating the ice and the absolute darkness, to reach the tall, vulnerable column of the Goltuk, the chimney, at the far end of the house. The chimney was the final critical point of failure. If the opening was blocked by wind-driven snow, or if the structure had shifted and caused an internal obstruction, the entire house was already doomed.
The pressure would have nowhere to release, and the deadly gases would backflow directly into the sleeping chamber. He pressed himself against the frozen mud and stone wall, moving cautiously toward the column of silent exhaust, his ears straining against the roar of the wind, waiting to confirm that the life-giving draft was still pulling the poison away from his family. Reaching the base, he slowly raised his head, eyes fixed on the column's lip.
He strained to see the thin, shimmering plume of smoke, the proof of combustion, the signature of warmth. It needed to be rising clean, straight into the merciless sky, dispersing high above the roofline. If it sank, the true enemy wasn't the screaming frost outside. It was the invisible assassin creeping from beneath the heated stones. In the dead stillness of the Scylla night, when the temperature plunged so low that the very air seemed to shatter, the family inside the house was performing the most terrifying balancing act known to man. They were trusting their lives to a pathway of smoke, a silent, subterranean river that had to flow perfectly, without exception, guiding the deadly remnants of combustion away from their sleeping bodies. If the deadly flow, the thick, heavy carbon monoxide, found even the smallest, most minute crack in the meticulously laid layers of clay and granite, the fate of the sleepers was sealed before they even dreamed. This wasn't merely a system of comfort. It was a pressurized, volatile environment, demanding human vigilance against the inevitable mechanical failure of earth and fire. A constant battle fought inches below the bedding. The structure itself was a masterpiece of ancient engineering, yet inherently flawed by the primitive materials of the time. The entire house was built upon a labyrinth, the Gorai, a complex network of narrow tunnels where the superheated air was forced to snake its way under the granite slabs of the floor. The efficiency of the ondol wasn't measured in comfort alone, but in the sheer, staggering distance the heat had to travel before finally being expelled through the chimney, the Yongi-do. Every single inch of that journey was a life or death engineering challenge, executed usually by the homeowners themselves, with terrifyingly variable quality control. A master builder could craft a system that held warmth for 24 hours on just 2 major firings. A clumsy neighbor could build a treacherous death trap that needed frantic tending every hour, threatening to either asphyxiate the inhabitants or simply let the relentless ice reclaim them by dawn. The stone floor, the sacred Gudul, acted as the massive, irreplaceable thermal battery, slowly absorbing the searing heat generated within the Agungi, the mighty combustion chamber, usually recessed into the kitchen or an outer room, roaring like a hungry giant.
But that absorption was slow, monumental, and, critically, irreversible once the stone reached its peak temperature. The heat wasn't gentle. It was intense, radiating upward, often creating a gradient so extreme that the sleeping area nearest the agungi, the honored Anbong side, could be almost scalding, forcing sleepers to shift, while the far end of the room remained chillingly cool, a stark reminder of the cold world just outside the door.
Some time after the moon crossed the absolute zenith, when the winter cold was at its most punishing, the designated watcher, often the grandmother or the eldest son, had to brave the outer darkness of the kitchen and perform the necessary, life-preserving midnight stoking. This was not a quick or easy task. It required opening the monstrous, heavy wooden mouth of the agunli, instantly releasing a blinding, hungry blast of accumulated heat and light into the pitch-dark room, momentarily vanquishing the oppressive night. The very moment the firebox door swung open, the carefully controlled pressure balance within the subterranean gore shifted violently. A sudden, massive intake of cold air could utterly disrupt the established flow of smoke, causing a sudden, terrifying backdraft, a chaotic reversal where the deadly exhaust gases, instead of moving efficiently toward the chimney, were instantly forced back toward the inner living area. These gases would escape through even the most minuscule, unnoticed hairline cracks in the clay-sealed floor, directly into the air breathed by the sleeping family. This was the moment of supreme, silent vulnerability. The watcher would frantically shove dry kindling and heavy, slow-burning oak logs into the roaring mouth, trying to feed the beast just enough to sustain the embers until the first weak light of morning, but not so much that the fire became uncontrollable and threatened to consume the entire straw-thatched roof above them in a cataclysmic inferno. The cold was loud, screaming with the sound of the wind rattling the rice paper doors and the crackling of the necessary wood. Carbon monoxide, however, was the unchallenged master of silence. It stole into the room without sound, without the sharp, alerting smell of smoke, a chemical ghost that promised a deeper, sweeter sleep than any tired body truly deserved. The first sign of trouble wasn't pain or panic, but a slight, persistent headache, easily dismissed as mere exhaustion from a long, harsh day, followed by an unusual sense of heavy-limbed peace and irresistible drowsiness. If the sleeper was lucky enough to wake up with a pounding head or terrible nausea, they were already past the danger threshold. Their blood was thick with the poison, and they had survived only by the sheer grace of a brief, lucky interruption in the gas flow. Perhaps a sudden, miraculous chimney draft clearing the air just enough to save them. To combat this ever-present, insidious threat, the engineering of the ondol had to be constantly checked and rechecked by the watchful community. The most critical, yet often neglected element was the yuldong, the carefully sculpted path and slope that ensured the smoke's velocity remained high enough to exit the chimney effectively, even when the fire was burning low and weak. If the smoke slowed down even slightly, it cooled down too rapidly, and heavy particulates settled instantly, clogging the narrow tunnels and guaranteeing a backup of poisonous gas directly toward the interior. Every few years, usually in the late autumn, just before the first killer frost descended, the men of the village had the gruesome, terrifying task of opening the Gore tunnels, crawling deep into the subterranean oven of dried soot and ash to physically clear the blockages. It was a filthy, dangerous job, performed in claustrophobic darkness, but it was absolutely essential. Failure to perform this maintenance was not mere negligence. It was a death sentence, delivered by slow. They knew that in this brutal, frozen landscape of 700 CE Korea, survival was never truly guaranteed. It was a daily negotiation with the hostile elements, and the ondol floor was merely the battlefield, a warm, deadly arena where the price of necessary comfort was eternal, nerve-wracking vigilance against the creeping dread of the cold and the silent, suffocating promise of the heat. The sun died a brutal, frozen death behind the mountains, and as the last sliver of weak light bled out of the sky, the true horror began. Day was a struggle against the mundane chill. Night was a duel with the ghost of the chimney. The entire household gathered, not in celebration of warmth, but in silent, terrified ritual. Every fiber of wood was a life savings, every plume of smoke a gamble against oblivion. The weight of survival rested entirely on the hands that fed the monstrous agungi, the gaping, hungry maw of the firebox, located usually in the kitchen or an outside lean-to, perpetually demanding sacrifice. The decision of what fuel to burn was a life or death calculation, far more complex than simply seeking maximum heat. They understood that the most immediate, searing flames, like those produced by dry pine, were the enemy. Such intensity could stress the foundational elements, causing the very stone they relied upon to warp or fissure. The true artistry of the ondol master lay in cultivating a slow, agonizingly deliberate burn. This required dense, compacted fuels, old, heavy hardwood that smoldered for hours, or bundles of dried rice straw and compressed charcoal dust mixed with clay, designed not for flash combustion, but for persistent, low-grade thermal saturation. This approach transformed the floor into a massive thermal battery, capable of radiating warmth long after the flames were nothing more than embers. They called the main heat channels the gorai, deep subterranean trenches running beneath the floor, designed to draw the superheated smoke not toward the ceiling, but horizontally across the bedrock of their existence, maximizing contact area before venting out the distant chimney. If the masonry failed, if the clay seals cracked even by a hairline fraction, the house became a pressurized gas chamber, forcing the poison gas back up through the floor. These trenches were covered by the gudel, massive, carefully fitted slabs of stone, often granite or slate, smoothed and cemented meticulously to present a seamless, warm sleeping surface. But stone expands and contracts. The cold outside warred perpetually with the searing heat inside, creating a structural stress few modern homes could ever withstand. This constant friction was the invisible hand of fate, waiting to shatter the fragile seal and unleash the silent executioner. The labor required to maintain this deadly equilibrium was ceaseless. The greatest danger was not the lack of heat, but the very source of comfort itself. The long, slow burn necessary for overnight warmth meant hours of incomplete combustion, creating the perfect environment for the deadly formation of carbon monoxide. The designated night watcher, usually the elder patriarch or matriarch, became the sentinel of the threshold between life and suffocation. They didn't sleep. They were required to constantly monitor the yondo, the chimney outlet, often trekking out into the brutal cold every hour to observe the smoke's behavior. The chimney was the gauge of their fate, the literal barometer of death. Too much smoke meant a clogged flow, poor draft, and a dangerous buildup of toxic gases being forced back into the house. Too little smoke meant the fire was sputtering out, condemning the family to a hypothermic awakening before dawn. It was a thermodynamic tightrope walk performed in the oppressive darkness, where the temperature outside plummeted toward oblivion, sometimes reaching lows that could freeze the marrow in the bones within hours. Outside, the Korean winter didn't just drop temperatures. It stole the breath right out of the air, a relentless, sentient predator. This enemy clawed at the thatched roofs, trying to leverage the smallest flaw in the building's envelope, demanding the return of the heat stolen from the earth. Every window, paper-thin and brittle, was a vulnerability. The cold was a constant, howling reminder that if the ondol failed, death would arrive not with a bang, but with the slow, agonizing grip of muscle seizure and organ shutdown. The internal threat, however, was arguably far more insidious. The residents, having lived their entire lives under the looming shadow of the gongkija, air poison, developed an almost primal sensitivity. Yet even that deep-seated caution could be fatally fooled. A faint, earthy odor of smoke was acceptable, even comforting. It meant the fire was working and sealed. But the moment that smell intensified, indicating a breach in the gudel, or worse, if a strange, odorless heaviness descended, panic was inevitable. Carbon monoxide, the ghost gas, was undetectable by human senses, binding to the blood cells without warning. Its signature was brutally subtle, a slight throbbing in the temples, a sudden, inexplicable nausea, or a sense of overwhelming drowsiness that felt suspiciously like the relief of finally being warm, but was actually the welcoming arms of eternal sleep. Maintaining the system was not a seasonal chore. It was a weekly battle against entropy. The soot had to be meticulously scraped from the gore, the smoke paths cleared, and the gudel inspected for cracks the width of a single hair. A single loose stone, a shifting earth foundation beneath the home, could compromise the entire thermal engine. Repairing a leak meant the agonizing process of tearing up the sleeping surface, exposing the treacherous trenches beneath, and potentially enduring days of sub-zero temperatures while the newly applied clay and mortar dried and cured. This was the true, unending cost of the ondol. Endless, physically exhausting vigilance rooted in the very fabric of their home. It was a house built on a pressure cooker, demanding respect and sacrifice in equal measure, where comfort and catastrophe were separated by a thin layer of stone and clay. Tonight, the fire was burning deep, a low guttural roar that was barely audible but profoundly felt through the soles of their feet, a dangerous, intoxicating promise. The sentinel watched the chimney, squinting into the blackness, measuring the smoke against the relentless pull of the freezing wind. He knew this warmth was a gift, a miracle of engineering forged centuries ago. But he also knew the price of the miracle, etched into the history of every family that had lost a loved one to the silent seep. He waited, listening to the labored breathing of his family lying on the deadly hearth, hoping the seal would hold, praying the lethal heat he had so carefully unleashed would remain beneath the stones and not rise to claim its due. The night was young, and the furnace of their survival was only just hitting its terrifying, deadly peak. The winter outside was not merely cold. It was an obsidian predator holding its breath, waiting for the frail heartbeat inside the house to fail. Inside the main living chamber, the heat radiating from the oiled paper floor had become almost oppressive, a blanket woven from the devil's own loom, forcing beads of sweat onto the brow of the sleeping mother. This was the moment the old ones feared most, the deep restorative slumber that came when the cold finally retreated, masking the arrival of the unseen executioner, the carbon monoxide ghost. Jeha, the patriarch who banked the fire, was not truly sleeping. His awareness was a thin, high wire stretched across the abyss of oblivion. His mind was tracing the path of the deadly smoke through the labyrinth beneath their feet, the complex system known as the gore, or the creeping path, the very structure that gave the system its name, meaning warm stones. These narrow, stone-lined tunnels were the heart of their survival, designed to channel the intense heat and flame from the agungi, the furnace mouth, across the entire surface of the room, before finally escaping through the gulduk, the chimney stack, positioned on the farthest, coldest wall. The engineering was ingenious, built upon centuries of observation, but its implementation was terrifyingly crude and vulnerable to the most minute structural failure. The stone slabs, known as guduljang, that formed the actual floor, were typically heavy river stones or specially cut slate, requiring immense effort to position. They were the reservoir of heat, designed to absorb and slowly release energy. But they were also porous, and the mud mortar sealing them was notoriously susceptible to cracking under the stress of rapid heating and cooling cycles. One tiny crack, one hairline fracture in the masonry of the gore structure below, and the poisonous breath would find its way upward, past the layers of red clay insulation, through the gaps in the guduljang, and into the very air the family depended on for life. The greatest danger was not the fierce, loud threat of fire, which gave warning, but the silent, odorless seepage that made men simply close their eyes in comfort and never wake again to see the dawn.
A faint sound, a sharp, quick tink, sliced through the heavy silence that had settled over the room. Jeha's eyes snapped open, his entire body instantly rigid with adrenaline. Was it the sound of the timber frame contracting violently in the extreme outer cold? Or was it the ominous sound of the intense heat expanding the massive flagstones of the floor, forcing the brittle clay seal to fracture under the immense internal pressure?
He held his breath, listening for the telltale rush of air escaping, or the faint metallic scent of incomplete combustion that might indicate a leak. The final defense against the underworld of fire and smoke was the paper layer, the heavy, oil-treated jangpan, which covered the stone. This tough, translucent barrier, often treated with thick bean oil, protected the stone from moisture and gave the floor its characteristic, gleaming dark hue. But tonight, this layer was a double-edged sword. It was a perfect insulator, holding the heat in, but it was also a perfect trap. If the lethal CO gas seeped up through the porous stone, the dense, oiled paper sealed it inside the room, preventing natural ventilation and sealing the family's terrible fate. Every autumn, the tedious, back-breaking work of checking the gore structure was mandatory, an act of ritual survival that demanded perfection. Stones had to be lifted, generations of stubborn soot scraped out, and fresh, wet mud applied with meticulous care to seal every joint and corner of the fire path. If the current generation had grown lax, if the work was rushed, or if the relentless winter snowmelt from weeks ago had compromised the foundations of the heart structure, tonight would be the night the ancestral neglect came due, the night the system turned on its masters. The deep heat was the very definition of life, but the gorae was a meticulously engineered, loaded weapon pointed directly at their heads, cocked by the very need to survive the brutal cold. The cold outside, sensing the internal heat surge, pressed harder, testing the structural limits of the walls. If the fire cooled even slightly, the freezing air would immediately begin its slow, capillary invasion, finding every unsealed crack and drawing the warmth out. The heat was centered, strongest at the point furthest from the furnace, but the children, sleeping near the outer walls, were dangerously close to the boundary where the blessing of warmth gave way to the deadly, numbing cold. Their small bodies could not withstand the sudden, precipitous temperature drop that would herald the approach of the merciless dawn. The true brilliance and sheer terror of the ondol lay in its massive thermal mass. Once the thick stone slabs were heated to their core, they retained that warmth for hours, sometimes even half a day, long after the last ember in the agungi had died to ash. This retention was their grace period, their window of safety, the fuelless coast toward morning. But if the stone temperature dropped below a critical, unseen point, The intense sub-zero cold outside would drag the interior temperature down violently, sucking the remaining life force out of the room with terrifying speed. Jeha slowly rose, his muscles protesting the small movement, the oiled paper creaking slightly under his weight. He could not rely on the stone's memory alone. He was the watchman. He crept toward the agunji opening, feeling the air shift dramatically as he moved away from the core heat zone. The cold air rushing through the cracks around the doors and the oiled paper windows was a physical weight against his exposed skin, a chilling reminder of the enemy beyond the walls. He needed to check the firebox immediately. Not to feed it now, that would create a dangerous, unmanageable surge of heat and smoke, but to ensure the slow, deliberate, agonizingly controlled combustion he had set hours ago was still holding steady, a disciplined furnace keeping death at bay. He didn't trust the fire's gentle murmur. That calm breathing was deceptive. The real danger lay not in the visible flames roaring in the akkun, the firebox he had stoked with such desperate care, but in the slow, creeping, invisible killer being brewed in the depths of the earth beneath his very feet. This was the terrifying trade-off of the Gudul system. You paid the bitter price of fuel to fight the winter demon, and in return the fire offered a lethal, silent executioner, the smoke, the byproduct of life-giving warmth, searching for the smallest fissure in the expertly laid stone. Every minute that passed, a cloud of carbon monoxide, odorless and utterly undetectable, was slithering through the network of flues known as the gore, pressurized by the heat below and desperate to escape upward. His ancestors had perfected this perilous art over centuries, the engineering feat of insulating the living floor, gurulchang, against both the cold earth and the scorching, poisonous gases below. But stone, even meticulously cut granite, was mortal. The extreme thermal differential, sub-zero air above, volcanic heat below, caused the stones to subtly shift, to breathe, to create microfractures barely visible to the naked eye, yet large enough to admit the breath of the grave. He imagined the serpentine path of the heated air, washing over the underside of the floor, depositing a critical layer of soot and ash, before finally being drawn toward the crucial Gae jetty, the exhaust stack that promised safe release. If the draw was inefficient, if the wind shifted and forced the toxic gases back, the entire house became a deadly pressure cooker, the air thickening into a tangible shroud. He slid his hand across the paper-covered floor. It was hot, blessedly, impossibly hot, radiating the life force that kept his family's blood flowing. But a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. Was it exhaustion from the brutal cold of checking the akkun? Or was this the subtle beginning of the invisible sickness? The lightheadedness, the dull ache behind the eyes. These were the first treacherous whispers of carbon monoxide poisoning, often mistaken for mere fatigue or the onset of winter sickness. The line between comfort and catastrophe was so thin It was transparent. He held his breath, forcing himself to focus on the small, critical details. The smell of the room. Was there any hint of acrid smoke? Any subtle sign that the subterranean horror was leaking through the cracks?
The choice of fuel was a life or death calculus he had learned since childhood. He had used aged oak, prized for its slow, steady, long-lasting ember bed, unlike quick-burning pine that created a violent flash heat and a sudden, dangerous rush of smoke that could overwhelm the flues and compromise the draft.
Every piece of wood was a timed fuse. Too much fuel packed into the akun could choke the fire, leading to incomplete combustion and a massive spike in carbon monoxide production, a lethal inefficiency hidden beneath the perfect warmth.
Too little, and the heat would die prematurely, leaving the stone floor to bleed its warmth back into the frozen soil long before dawn broke, guaranteeing a slow, chilling death from exposure. The entire operation demanded the precision of a master clockmaker, operating in total darkness and crushing cold, with human lives as the ticking mechanism.
The outer world was sealed shut. Rice paper plastered over the windows. Thick straw mats pressed against the doors. Every breach was an invitation for the winter antagonist to claim its prize. But sealing the house so effectively amplified the threat from below. If the exhaust was blocked, the house became an airtight chamber, guaranteeing rapid suffocation. It was a paradox. Fight the external enemy by sealing it out, but in doing so, you trapped the internal enemy with deadly efficiency. He looked toward his wife and children, bundled tight under layers of heavy cotton, relying completely on the subterranean inferno he maintained. Their survival was literally resting on a thin layer of stone and clay mortar, a geological shield against dual forms of death. The feeling of that warmth, radiating up through the floor, was the most profound sensation of security a man in this era could know. A security bought with relentless vigilance and the constant specter of instantaneous disaster. He checked the Gechari opening one last time, squinting into the freezing night air, confirming that the slender wisp of toxic smoke was indeed rising and dispersing into the vast, indifferent sky, rather than pooling back toward the hearth. He had bought them a few more hours of treacherous, magnificent life, holding the line against the silent executioner. The morning light, thin and cruel, did little to warm the hearts of the Kim family. The crisis of the smoke inversion had passed, but the cost was a sleepless night spent feeding the beast, pushing the precious pine scraps into the hungry mouth of the agungi. Elder Kim's relief was a brittle thing, fragile as the dried clay plaster clinging to the walls of the flue tunnels, the very tunnels, the gore, that determined whether they lived or died when the sun went down again. He knew with the cold certainty of a man who has faced this specific peril for 60 winters that the true enemy wasn't just the chimney blockage, but the ceaseless, grinding stress of temperature extremes on the meticulously constructed floor.
The integrity of the gore was everything. These were not mere empty spaces. They were precisely engineered conduits of death and life, laid beneath heavy stone slabs, the Goodell.
Over time, the relentless heating and subsequent cooling caused microfractures, invisible hairline splits spiderwebbing through the foundational clay. A normal, temperate climate might allow these faults to remain dormant, minor cracks in the armor. But this was Zhanghan's soul, the great cold snow, where the very ground was a grinding engine of destruction.
When the earth froze deeper than a man's height, the moisture trapped within the clay walls of the flue expanded, driven by the brutal thermodynamic forces of the winter antagonist.
This was hydraulic fracturing on an elemental, terrifying scale, slowly prying the tunnel structure apart, widening those tiny faults into gaping, invisible chasms beneath their feet. If a major breach occurred, the heated air and deadly carbon monoxide would no longer be properly drawn out through the chimney, the Yontu, but would instead leak directly up through the segmented Goodell stones and into the sealed room.
They wouldn't hear it. They wouldn't smell it. Not until the insidious, odorless killer had already begun its work, creeping like a ghostly tide across the sleeping bodies.
Younger Kim, having just cleared the smoke shelf, now knelt by the edge of the floor, his ear pressed against the warm stone, listening not for sound, but for the absence of sound. The sound of earth shifting, the ominous settling groan that spoke of impending collapse.
The old farmers had a name for the phenomenon of structural failure induced by deep frost. They called it the winter sigh, the low, grinding exhalation of the earth itself, preparing to swallow the warmth whole.
The greatest danger spot, Elder Kim remembered from his youth, was where the gore connected to the main firebox, the agungi. This junction point bore the most intense thermal stress, the fiercest temperature differential between the roaring fire and the frozen bedrock just inches away.
He had seen houses lost, not to fire, but to the slow, agonizing asphyxiation brought on by a sudden, unseen structural failure at the hearth entrance. It was here they must focus their vigilance, applying thin, watery slurry, a temporary, desperate bandage to the outside earthen skirt of the house, hoping to seal any new cracks before the freezing water could penetrate and widen them further. This required going outside, stepping from the magnificent, treacherous warmth onto the frozen tundra was a moment of true terror. It felt like stepping off the edge of the world into a vacuum of heat. The air instantly seized the moisture in the lungs, turning breath into crystalline dust that vanished into the pale blue void. Elder Kim wrapped himself in heavy hemp padding and straw mats, strapping them tight, preparing for the 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours of excruciating exposure, a necessary sacrifice to placate the maintenance gods. He observed the telltale signs, tiny plumes of steam rising, not from the chimney tip, but from unexpected places near the foundation line. These were ghosts, silent warnings. Each wisp of vapor was a small escape hatch, a structural weakness through which precious heat and potentially lethal exhaust was escaping the carefully regulated system. He spotted a thin, shivering ribbon of steam rising exactly where the main flue turned toward the chimney base, a sign that the freezing cycle had done its work overnight. The internal clay lining, the protective barrier, had cracked. He moved quickly, his fingers already numb after 30 seconds, working the thick, muddy paste into the fissure. He worked with the intensity of a surgeon operating on his own heart, knowing that a clumsy movement could widen the fault, accelerating the structural suicide of his home. Every second outside was a theft from his life force, the extreme cold draining his core temperature. But every second spent sealing the gore was a profound investment in the continuation of his lineage. He could feel the residual heat of the flue radiating through the earthen skirting, a miraculous warmth against the glacial air, yet simultaneously a lethal proximity to the silent killer circulating inside.
Younger Kim watched through the paper screen door, his hands clasped, praying to the household gods that his father would not succumb to the cold, or worse, slip and fall, breaking a vital limb in the unforgiving ice.
The survival of the family hinged on this fragile, muddy barrier, this temporary repair against the titanic forces of nature and entropy that relentlessly sought to dismantle the miracle of the Ondol. The crack sealed, the steam vanished. Elder Kim staggered back inside, his face the color of polished jade, collapsing onto the warm floor, where the very stone pulsed with the magnificent, terrifying heart of the fire he had just risked everything to contain. The line held, for now, but the winter sigh had been heard, and the structural integrity of their savior executioner had been permanently compromised. The game of lethal geometry was far from over. The winter's blow, that earth-shaking shudder which had rattled the foundation of the chief's house, was not just a scare, it was a verdict. Deep beneath the hardened clay and oiled paper, where the fire's breath was meant to sprint, the labyrinthine paths of the gore had shifted. These smoke channels, meticulously engineered tunnels that snaked under the sleeping mats, were the very arteries of survival. Now they were pinched, cracked, and whispering of blockage. The delicate, lethal ballet of thermodynamics was breaking down. When a main channel narrows, the fiery breath, the superheated combustion gases, has nowhere to go but back. Pressure mounts in the subterranean furnace vault, a ticking clock buried in the earth itself. The danger was no longer a sudden burst of flame, but a slow, insidious reversal of airflow, guaranteeing an eventual, silent exhalation of death into the breathing space above. Inside the agungi, the fire pit carved into the kitchen wall, the combustion was becoming sluggish. Elder Mei Rin, whose eyesight was failing, but whose ear for the fire was flawless, noticed the change first. The roaring, hungry sound that signaled a clean draw had been replaced by a heavy, wet hiss. The sound of suffocating heat struggling against the confines of the collapsed masonry. The pine and oak scraps they burned, the precious fuel harvested through weeks of grueling labor, were no longer turning to clean white ash. Instead, the smoke, thick and black as spilled ink, was struggling to ascend the Yontong, the chimney stack at the far end of the house. This dark, oily smoke, laden with the unspent energy of partially burned fuel and the toxic ghost of carbon monoxide, was now seeking the path of least resistance. And that path, inevitably, led back through the compromised structure and up through the gaps in the floor tiles. The floor, their magnificent radiant heater, began to speak in uneven temperatures. One corner, usually a haven of warmth where the grandmother slept, was now ice cold, a dead zone signaling a total collapse of the underlying gore. Meanwhile, the spot directly over the main furnace exit became dangerously, blisteringly hot. This wasn't comfort. This was a fever spiking in specific, dangerous places. A floor that burns the soles of your feet in one spot, while leaving your shoulders shivering in another, is not a friend. It is a failing machine, ready to detonate. The villagers began to dread the evening ritual, the moment they laid their thick, padded sleeping mats, yos, onto the floor. Were they insulating themselves from the cold, or merely sealing themselves into a gas chamber? The line between necessary heat and lethal heat had never been finer. Outside, the blizzard intensified its siege. The wind was not merely blowing, it was actively sucking the air pressure down the chimney stack, fighting the natural convection that pulled the toxic smoke away from the house. This was the winter's final counterattack, using physics itself as a weapon. The low atmospheric pressure, coupled with the dense, cold air pressing down, created a powerful inverse draft. Every gust was a calculated move, forcing the deadly gases back down the flue and into the tunnels under the chief's chambers. They were caught in a catastrophic loop. To burn hotter and force the smoke out was to risk fire and rapid structural collapse. To burn colder was to invite the freezing embrace of death within hours. The choice was between a quick, violent end or a slow, silent one. Then came the smell. Not the sweet, clean scent of burning hardwood, but a thick, cloying stench, the unmistakable odor of incomplete combustion and damp soot fighting its way through the clay sealants. It settled over the sleeping room like a heavy, invisible shroud. Young children, the first victims of the poisonous air, because of their lower body mass and faster respiratory rate, began to stir restlessly, their sleep shallow and punctuated by soft, hacking coughs. Their mothers, usually lulled into deep slumber by the floor's warmth, were jolted awake by an unnatural lightness in their heads, a dizzying nausea that tasted of metal and dread. This wasn't merely a draft. It was the carbon monoxide ghost beginning its hunt. It had slipped through microfractures in the clay, microscopic highways carved by the earth tremor. And now, it was silently displacing the life-giving oxygen in the chamber. The very atmosphere of the room was turning hostile. Elder Mayrin, clutching his chest and fighting the sudden, inexplicable dulling of his senses, knew the grim truth. The crack in the gore was not just letting heat escape, it was letting death in. They had fought the visible enemy, the frost, the storm, the ice. But now They faced the invisible assassin, the byproduct of the very heat that saved them. They were breathing in the exhaust of their own survival, trapped in the lethal inefficiency of a damaged machine. They were witnessing the catastrophic failure mode of the Ondol, the moment the system stops being an elegant solution and becomes a sealed chamber of asphyxiation. Every breath was a gamble, every minute of sleep an unacceptable risk. The next few hours, before the sun dared to touch the frozen landscape, would be a test of pure, desperate vigilance against the most insidious trap the Ondol system could set: lethal thermal efficiency turning against its masters. The compromised floor was now a ticking, smoking bomb of stone and clay.